Well, a very good morning to you all, ladies and gentlemen, and my Lord Mayor, thank you so much for opening this conference this morning so powerfully with your speech and what you told us and what you said to us. My name is Chris Hayward. I'm the Policy Chairman of the City of London Corporation, or the de facto political leader of the corporation, and I'm delighted to be chairing this panel today discussing the achievements and the challenges of COP27 and what is next for sustainable finance with a panel of experts from across the industry. Now, I was at COP27 this year in Sharm el-Sheikh, as I know a number of the members of the panel were, and I recall there the COP26 President Alok Sharma stating that the pulse of 1.5 degrees target is still alive, but it remains on life support. And I think that's actually quite a good summary of the challenge that we face at this particular time. And there are real challenges to solve on our journey to net zero. But it was evident in Egypt that those challenges are matched by great ambition from the professional and financial services industry. In particular, as the Lord Mayor mentioned, we announced there, Lord Mayor, myself, on behalf of the corporation, our Net Zero Delivery Summit next May in this very building, and I hope as many of you will come as possible to that. It is timed deliberately halfway between the two COPs, and as the Lord Mayor rightly says, it will focus very much on delivery and what we're actually doing to achieve the targets we've set ourselves. And it will aim to keep momentum going for sustainable finance between those two COPs. And this conversation today with this panel is a great opportunity to start reflecting on that journey. So to kick off, I'm going to ask each of my panelists in turn the same fairly light-hearted but actually fairly fundamental question. But before answering it, perhaps I could ask each of you to introduce yourself and your firm for the benefit of the audience, and we'll just go from right to left. And all I want to know at the start is, in one word, please, just one word, can you tell us what best sums up COP27 for you and why?
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm delighted to be here. My name's Tom Tayler. I am from Aviva Investors, working in their sustainable finance team, as well as being part of the finance team of the high-level climate champions. My word, I think, is insufficient. And I don't mean that in as negative a way as perhaps it sounds. I think the COP process is always going to be insufficient, but it's absolutely necessary. And it showed itself again to be necessary in Sharm el-Sheikh with some really positive things, particularly the announcement of the creation of a mechanism for a loss and damage fund, which has huge moral importance to countries really suffering losses and damages, but also some other breakthroughs that I'll talk about in my longer remarks. So necessary, but insufficient, because we haven't yet got ourselves on the path we need to be on.
Okay, thank you.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Kate Levick. I'm the Associate Director for Sustainable Finance at E3G, which is a think tank that focuses on the politics of climate change and climate change policy. We're headquartered here in London and have worked very closely on COPs for a number of years. So I thought this was a very mean question to be asking. However, my one word is money. And I think, just very briefly, I think we all knew going into COP that the finance issues under negotiation could make or break it, and that did indeed prove to be the case with the sort of brinkmanship at the end and the traditional delay in getting the final agreement going even further than normal, as these financial issues were, so key to getting that agreement. At the same time, coming out of this COP, and also I think in wider things happening at the same time, like the G20 leaders, we saw more and more discussion of whole system financial reforms for public and private finance, and more of an understanding that that is needed to solve the climate challenge.
Thank you very much indeed.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Malim. I'm a finance partner at Eversheds, Sutherland. Thank you for having me. I think that my word would be fairness, picking up on a couple of the themes, and perhaps the one that Tom made. We saw very much with the loss and damage initiative and some of the commentary from, for example, the Belgian Prime Minister, very much around the need to balance the impact of climate change globally on the most vulnerable populations and how we get them out of the trap, the debt cycle that they frequently find themselves in as a result of the disasters that can occur as a result of climate change. So I think that's the word that I would pick.
Thanks. I'm Alice Carr. I'm Executive Director for Public Policy at the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And I nearly said, I think I'm still recovering from COP. I haven't quite come to terms with it. So it's hard to summarize. I nearly said complicated, which I think was for reasons similar to Tom's. But I might, just for a bit of positivity, go for inclusive. And I don't mean inclusive in terms of, all the issues, they clearly were about attendance and participating and so on, but more that I think the focus shifted a little bit to financing transition in emerging markets and developing economies, as well as dealing with loss and damage in a very positive way. And, I think it's going to take a lot of collective effort to make that work. And I'm not talking about the 100 billion, but which is actually in itself completely insufficient to finance transition in the large emerging markets, but more the emerging efforts around collective platform efforts on energy transition and so on and so forth, which we might come back to. Thanks.
Thank you all very much. Thank you for your opening words, as it were, or individual words summarising COP27. Tom, you were there this year, like me, at COP27. Could you perhaps start by telling us why should financial services, in particular investors, actually care? What is the science telling us?
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I'm going to take those the other way around, actually. I'll start with the science and then talk about why finance really should care. And I probably don't need to tell anybody in the room that we're in real trouble. The consequences of continuing to increase, and we are continuing to increase, the emissions of greenhouse gases are understood better than ever. And the scientists are clearer than they've ever been. And yet we continue to do the thing that we know is causing greater and greater damage. So this year is 30 years since the Rio Earth Summit at which the UNFCCC was created. And if you go back and look at the Rio Declaration, a lot of it is still on the to-do list as opposed to having been achieved even 3 decades on. And around half of the emissions since the mid-18th century have come since 1992, which is absolutely extraordinary. And the world's countries came together and they said, states shall cooperate in a spirit of global partnership to conserve, protect, and restore the health and integrity of the Earth's ecosystem, which is still pretty much the mission statement we need to face. What's the science telling us? The science is telling us that the last 7 years are the 7 hottest years on record. 2022 has seen floods in Pakistan and elsewhere, fires in the United States, Australia, Northern Europe, great rivers like the Loire, the Rhine, and the Yangtze drying up to a trickle, record temperatures, record-breaking storms, and this is a year where the La Nina effect is actually making it a cool year. So goodness knows what happens when we have a hot one. We've seen Arctic temperatures 40 degrees above the average, which is just extraordinary. We are moving towards planetary boundaries and tipping points, and these tipping points are one-way doors. When you go through them, you change to a different system state that we can't get back to, which is incredibly worrying. If we go through those one-way doors, then at the moment, the scientists tell us that if we stop putting emissions up into the atmosphere, we can stabilize temperatures. If we find ways, as well as the natural ways of reducing the emissions in the world, if we find ways of doing that, then we can even bring them down. But if we go through those tipping points, we may lose the ability to do that and lose control of essentially our destiny. Warming is a bit like a flywheel that since the mid-17th century has been getting faster and faster and faster, and then it falls to us to slow it down and stop it. And stopping a flywheel is an incredibly volatile and difficult thing. But as Barack Obama said, we're the first generation to feel the effects of climate change and the last generation who can do anything about it. And the thing is that the effects of every ton of carbon dioxide, every fraction of a degree, are not linear, but neither does our response need to be. We can have an exponential response to the way that we deal with climate change, and we're starting to see this, and this brings me to why does finance care and what can finance do? So finance should care out of enlightened self-interest. If we carry on the pathway we're on, then the UNEP emissions gap report tells us we'll hit nearly 3 degrees of warming by the century's end. And that's an existential threat to the stability of the financial system. And at 3 degrees, insurance probably doesn't work as a business model. You might be able to price the risk, but the cost that we'd have to ask for it as an insurer, and Aviva is a big insurer, will probably make it unaffordable. And there were already signs of insurers and reinsurers withdrawing from markets that they don't want to underwrite because the risks are too great. And if you don't have insurance, then you can't do project finance. If you don't have insurance, then you can't pool risk. You can't do trade because no one wants their cargo to be uninsured at sea or in the air. Our whole global economy relies on the 3 limbs of finance working together: insurance, banking, and asset management. And if you take one of those out, the other 2 fall over. So we really have a self-interest in playing a huge role in shifting the trajectory, and we can do that as finance, because we heard, I agree with what Kate said, the importance of money and systemic transformation in COP and in our response here. And there are huge sums of money needed, as Alice said. It's the 100 billion has symbolic value, but it's the 5 trillion a year we need to finance the transition that's far more important. And that, or a proportion of that, is going to have to come from private financial markets. And we had in COP a huge breakthrough, a recognition in the outcome text that financing will take nothing less than a transformation of the financial system, its systems and processes. And that is a huge focus. So we can have this S-curve type effect on the transition. We're seeing it in renewable energy. We're seeing it in EVs. The IEA this week has said that there is going to be more renewables deployed in the next 5 years than in the last 20. China deployed more wind power in 2021 than the rest of the world did in the previous 5 years. This is getting faster and faster, and it's what Mark Carney described as the greatest economic opportunity of the age. And that's why it's, again, in finance's self-interest to lean in and to play a part in fixing this. And it's an all-hands-on-deck situation. So finance can't be asked to do this alone. We need the real economy. We need to see the transition plans of the real economy companies that we can invest in. Say, well, we can see how you are going to play your role, how you're going to step up and you can be part of this low-carbon economy. We're going to give you money, we'll invest in you, lend to you, underwrite you. And similarly, we need to work with governments and say, well, this is the enabling environment we need. These are the conditions we need to deploy capital, to deploy our clients' capital in a way that helps solve this crisis, not make it worse. So huge role for finance to play, Chris.
Tom, thanks very much indeed for that. Johnny, can I turn to you? Eversheds, Sutherland have just published today a report taking stock of what happened at COP27 for finance. With the experience of writing that paper, what stood out for you as the key takeaways from the conference?
Thank you, Chris. But it was an interesting point, I think, picking just up on the one that Tom made about the existential threat to the financial sector, which really just reflects an existential threat to all of us. That's the point. We cannot and we should not decouple those 2 things. So for me, looking at it, it was the importance of the private sector and the likes of the City of London and similar bodies taking a lead when it comes to financing the transition. And that needs to include engaging with the public finance initiatives to encourage de-risking and the scaling of investment in the transition that will be required. We saw clearly the tensions at a sovereign level, the limitations on the COP process, which you alluded to, I think were thrown into fairly stark relief. Decarbonisation, as mentioned by Chris in particular, reducing reliance on fossil fuels, remains subject to significant resistance from many key players. And there are sometimes sound political reasons behind that, no matter how frustrating we may find them at an international level. As we acknowledge in the report, governments around the world, including ours, are facing all manner of adverse economic headwinds, finding energy independence, cost of living crisis, and those can lead, if we're not careful, to climate concerns actually being shunted down the order of domestic priority for many countries. And for reasons not unconnected to that, I tend to be wary about the prospects for the loss and damage initiative, desirable though it clearly is. The core polluter pays principle that underlies that is long-standing. It was enshrined by the OECD in the 70s. It underpins a lot of domestic environmental legislation at a national level. It's enshrined in the EU treaties, but it's clearly still highly politically controversial at an international level as between individual nation states, particularly between the rich countries and poor. So in this respect, I think for myself at the moment I'm more persuaded by the direction of travel that was suggested by the Belgian Prime Minister I mentioned earlier, Mia Motley. The idea, and I know that there was a letter about this to the Economist recently that Aviva was a signatory to, or Steve was, about recasting Bretton Woods for the modern age to create a plan to combat the impacts of climate change for vulnerable nations as we go into the future, which seems perhaps more achievable than pure loss and damage. And that just brings me back to the role of private capital. By contrast to national governments and regulators, private capital, people in this room, big business, we are inherently cross-border in nature, and therefore I think better placed and better served by taking an internationalist approach to this. And maybe we are the ones to work with the DFIs, as people imagine, for that Bretton Woods 2 scenario. And that, of course, brings into focus the absolute importance, and clearly I would say this being a lawyer, of having commonly accepted and clearly delineated guidelines, standards and goals that all of us in the financial sector and the capital markets can look to when we are seeking to mobilize investment in the real economy in that sustainable direction. And that is the central theme of the financial institution net zero transition plans that GFANZ published during COP27. Alice, I don't know if you want to make a comment on that. Sorry to...
Yeah, definitely. I'll come on and speak about them shortly, but yeah, for us, they're a key tool for the financial sector to think about how it's going to finance transition through time. And so we're hoping with our framework to kind of level up everybody globally in terms of how they approach transition planning in the financial sector. But of course, we'd like governments and the real economy to do it too, as was mentioned. Thanks.
So let me then, thanks very much, Johnny, for that. Let me then, Alice, ask you a little bit more in terms of GFANZ. You've now brought together, I think, some 550 financial institutions in 50 countries of the world, all of whom have committed to supporting the real economy transition to net zero by 2050, consistent with the 1.5 degrees. So where are we on that journey at the moment, and what has GFANZ worked on this year to support financial institutions follow through on those commitments made in Glasgow?
Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, it's so last year was very much about building up commitment to transition. Although it's been kind of pleasing to see that this year, even against the backdrop of a difficult macroeconomic situation, that the kind of net inflow of firms has been quite strong. So our membership's gone up by 100 through to COP27. And a broader spread of countries. And just to note, we're also in the process of standing up regional networks to try and get at the transition issues that exist in APAC. So we have an APAC network up and running, which is chaired by the Monetary Authority of Singapore governor, and they're going to look at coal phase out. And then we also have an Africa network running, which is chaired by the UN High-Level Champion for Climate, and they're going to look at particular challenges in financing transition in the region. But what we've been doing, now all the firms are in. The firms themselves have been working out how to set their targets to deliver on their net zero commitments. And then, meanwhile, we've been working with our members in about 7 or 8 different work streams to almost develop the toolkit for transition finance. And this is kind of a pan-sector toolkit that is designed to be usable by firms across the value chain in the financial sector to help forge consistency. But of course, the underlying sectoral alliances are picking up the kind of sector-specific issues. And at the heart of this is the transition finance, this transition finance toolkit is the net zero transition planning, just as mentioned by Johnny. And that basically identifies kind of 4 broad buckets of activity that firms should be thinking about financing: climate solutions, companies and assets that are already aligned to a net zero pathway, firms that are, and then now we get to the majority of the economy, firms that are in the process of aligning to a sectoral pathway. So I think the idea is that, the place that finance can make the biggest impact is by engaging with those firms and helping ensure they get on the appropriate pathway. But we also have done some really important work this year on how to deal with the managed phase-out of assets that need to be stranded ultimately, but which we can't just turn off overnight, including given the energy crisis. So we sort of looked at the landscape. We've set out for financial institutions, or they've set out for themselves through the work stream, the core features of a good transition plan. We've got some supporting tools around what we want from real economy firms as financial institutions, how to use sectoral pathways, how to use portfolio alignment tools, how to think about managed phase-out. And I think the challenge now is sort of quickly ramping up the extent to which we're all doing transition planning in the financial sector to think about the activities we're financing, but also this is inevitably going to require a lot of engagement with the real economy, with real economy corporates in terms of the challenges they're facing to transition, but also government. And we've had quite an important work stream this year, which Tom has been involved in, which is around what does the financial sector need to see from governments in order to be able to finance the transition smoothly, because clearly this is a multi-stakeholder problem. And I'll leave it there. I think we're going to come back a bit and talk more about the kind of emerging market challenge. But yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Alice. Can I turn to you now, Kate? The TPT has just published a new gold standard for firms' transition plans, which, frankly, I think is a fantastic achievement, really showcasing UK leadership. How do we make sure that firms follow the guidance and produce credible, quality transition plans?
Great, thanks. Well, if I may, I'll just take one step back to answer that question, because I don't want to assume that everyone in the audience knows what TPT stands for, although I hope some of you do. So Alice has just very helpfully set the scene by talking about private sector transition planning and the growing momentum around that and all the great work that's been done by GFANZ, which of course is got an international membership of financial sector firms. So the TPT stands for the Transition Plan Taskforce, and that was something that was created at COP26 by Rishi Sunak when he was the Chancellor. He stood up then and said that the UK would require listed companies and financial firms to disclose their climate transition plans by 2023. This would be part of the sustainability disclosures regime. And given that it was understood that there wasn't really an existing benchmark of what good practice was at that point, he also said that he would set up a task force to set out what a gold standard looks like in that UK and regulatory context. So one important sort of distinction between the work that GFANZ has been doing to set out what a good transition plan looks like and the work that TPT has done is that TPT is sort of in that pre-regulatory space, looking forward specifically to this UK regulation, which will be a jurisdictional approach. One of the very first sort of helping to set international norms, hopefully. Another thing that's a little bit different in the UK task force is that it's slightly more multi-stakeholder in its composition. So it's co-chaired by a Treasury Minister and by Amanda Blanc, who's the co-CEO, the group CEO of Aviva. It has a membership of firms, many of which are leading firms in GFANZ, as is Aviva, but also it has the FCA, it has GFANZ on the steering group. We have the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. We have WWF UK. So there's a slightly different sort of mixture of stakeholder perspectives, and then there's a larger delivery group that has been involved in the work and the drafting and brought in a great deal more sectoral and specific expertise. I'm sure that there are firms in this room who've been involved in some of that work. So, sorry, that's all a bit of a long preamble, but just to give some context to that. Now, at COP27, I should have said, by the way, why am I talking about the TPT? So when I introduced myself, I forgot to say that I am the co-head of the Secretariat for the TPT. That's one of the responsibilities that E3G took on after the COP26 announcement, and we share that duty with the Centre for Greening Finance and Investment. So my equivalent co-head there is Dr. Ben Caldecott from Oxford University. So we came back to COP27 with some delivery, because of course COP27 was billed as the delivery COP, having supported from the Secretariat side the task force to do a huge amount of work over the last year, including a call for evidence back in May that was announced at this year's Net Zero Delivery Summit, and then through to some serious drafting. We put out for consultation a disclosure framework and some guidance, and those are out for consultation right now. So I would really encourage everybody to go and have a look at those. The website is transitiontaskforce.net, and the consultation is open until February. We really want to get a lot of input in how to make these as practical and usable as possible. And here I think I'm starting to come back to your question, which is, how do we make sure that firms, I'm just checking that I have the question right, how do we make sure that firms follow the guidance and produce credible, high-quality transition plans? Well, one of the things to do is to make sure that we produce a really good standard for what a good transition plan looks like in the first place. And that's why that multi-stakeholder input is so important, from the users, from the practitioners who will create these plans. And we know that there are a number of different types of users. These include the shareholders who will be looking at these plans when they assess companies, when it comes to AGM votes or when they're making investment decisions. It applies to sort of financial sector, firms that make a business out of, providing ratings or assessments of firms or indices. It includes sort of civil society organisations that will no doubt also be looking at these plans and ranking them and producing their own scorecards and so on. But crucially, what we're also seeing, and this is something that came out very much from COP27, is this pivot to regulation, away from all these pledges and plans being just something that's in the voluntary space and being something that is required, as will be the case in the UK, and also scrutinised by regulators. So we see different financial regulators in the UK and all over the world increasingly starting to look at transition plans as a key regulatory tool, increasingly starting to put in requirements that firms do create these plans. And of course, they will be looking at them, as will a whole range of other stakeholders, and that will be a mechanism that helps ensure that credible plans are produced.
Thanks very much, Kate. Tom, can I ask you, as an insurer, how do you approach transition planning? How do we balance a necessary risk management focus with also driving returns and progress?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, as Kate's mentioned, we're big fans of transition planning with Amanda co-leading the task force and actually the work stream in GFANZ. And the thing is, for a financial services firm who obviously should be producing their own transition plans, but in terms of looking at the corporates in particular that they underwrite, that they invest in, that they lend to, a transition plan is really the best friend they've got in terms of a lot of the information they're given is backward-looking. And we have to put on all our documents that past performance is no guide to the future. But actually, in this transition, I think that's never been more true than it is today. If someone tells you they know what 2030 is going to look like, then I would suggest you should tell them you don't believe them. But a transition plan, so if you've got a 2050 target, 2040 target, whatever it is, senior management aren't likely to be in place when that has to be delivered. But if you've got a transition plan that includes short-term interim targets, tells you what you're going to do in 1 year, 3 years, 5 years, you report against it each year so people can see if that progress is being made, that brings a 2050 target into the boardroom today. And when it comes to assessing making long-term investments, structuring big projects that will require underwriting for the long term, a transition plan is hugely important. And I think it's really important we get them from the corporates, we get them from the financial sector. As Alice's policy work stream said, we need them from governments too, because this is the all hands on deck point I made earlier. We need to know from governments which sectors are they prioritising with their policy, where should investments be heading, and so those transition plans are important. And then I also mentioned one of the big things that was hugely positive in COP, which was this statement of the need to transition the whole of the financial system, and we heard about the Bridgetown agenda and the Bretton Woods reform, and we need to think not just about the Bretton Woods institutions, but also all the other financial institutions and regulators. We need plans from them too at the global architecture level, so that we can see what the global transition plan for finance will look like.
Thanks very much. Johnny, back to you if I can. You're a long-standing advocate of sustainable finance, I know. What is your perspective on where we are now as an industry following COP27? I suppose what I really want to ask you is, has the money caught up with the science?
Well, I think it was, certainly from my side, it was one of my tutors at university, sadly a quarter of a century ago or more, who opined to me that we'd only really see progress on combating climate change when the money caught up, which makes for a nice catchphrase. We talked about this among ourselves before sitting down here, and I think we're all in agreement that the money has not caught up yet. Where we are is that the money is starting to catch up, or at the very least recognizing the imperative to do so. We are, all, after all in this room, and Chris, you were saying that you are spending a lot of time at sustainable events of one sort or another. Look, finance was a key theme of COP26, and it was another core theme at COP27, and probably the one that gained the most traction, precisely because it won't rely or doesn't rely on the sorts of delicately choreographed action at a geopolitical level that has frustrated so many. And there is a sense, perhaps, that the financial services sector may at last be approaching something resembling an inflection point in terms of attitudes and action. You can look at the various industry-driven initiatives that we've talked about and the reports that have been published. Another one that you could think of would be the one from the Paris-aligned assets owners, and you get a sense of a nettle starting to be grasped. But I think the key point that we'd all agree on, and those of us engaged in finance in whichever way, is that it's not just a case of looking at this from the perspective of shepherding our clients towards reducing their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. It's also, as GFANZ in their report made clear, about all of us being aware of and taking positive action to reduce our own Scope 3 emissions. And for anyone who's not up on that, Scope 3 emissions are the indirect sort that we can all incur, for example, by financing polluting industries. And I think, being a lawyer for a minute, there are three core themes here, and those would be trusts, standards, and value. It's very easy to be cynical about COP and point to the failures, and people do. So it's correspondingly crucial that everybody trusts in sustainable finance. They trust that what we're doing is genuinely contributing to the fight for a sustainable future. And I don't mean just trust by business, finance, and government. Trust is going to rely on educating and taking voters with us. They elect our legislators by assuring them that this is not something being done purely at their expense. That's the just transition, key plank thereof. Politicians will tell you that they hear their constituents grumbling that they think the green agenda will only make their life more expensive. There's a credibility gap for you if ever there was one. We need to show the public, particularly in wealthy developed nations like this one, that this isn't just the global financial elite somehow cooking up new ways to make money at what they perceive to be their expense. And I think that's one of the many reasons why greenwashing, if not addressed urgently, is toxic, to use a phrase that's relevant here. And that brings me on to standards. As we've all mentioned, there are numerous organizations that have formulated all manner of standards, green standards, sustainable principles, climate standards, and so on and so forth. And in some instances, it's the entity tasked with certifying whether a particular business or transaction meets the required standards that also set the standards. That doesn't engender a great deal of faith. And there is a data gap, in terms of the consistency, the comparability, and the accuracy of the underlying information. And all of that risks creating legal risk and compliance equivalent of white noise. Perhaps we should call it green noise. But either way, it confuses people in a way that is unhelpful and muddies the picture for what we're trying to achieve. And that simply takes us back in a circular manner to the trust point. It becomes difficult for all of us, financiers, investors, and indeed lawyers, to determine how these standards compare. How do you truly ascertain performance, and how do you figure out which businesses and transactions measure up from the perspective of a climate transition? And that's why the likes of GFANZ and the International Sustainability Standards Boards, for example, have sought to address this by setting out common frameworks that are designed to support greater comparability. And they, and all of us in private capital, have a role to play, I think, in blazing a path that the regulators and the governance can follow. And so lastly, to value. As finance lawyers, we're still often asked why by prospective borrowers. Why should I borrow via a green bond or a sustainability-linked loan? Where is the fabled greenium? Now, greenium's something of a rabbit hole, and I don't intend to fully go down it today. But suffice to say that I think that seeking greenium is entirely the wrong way of looking at value here. It falls into the short-termism trap that Mark Carney has talked about, and it certainly exhibits a lack of systems thinking. Now, I think we probably all agree, that the art here will be in persuading businesses in the real economy that implementing measures towards ensuring environmental sustainability and the climate transition are inextricably linked not only to sustaining their current economic value, but also creating future economic value, which goes back to the economic opportunity point that is not to be overlooked.
Thanks very much. I wouldn't want a panel like this to pass without talking, Alice, a bit about the developing economies, the emerging markets. We all know that we cannot achieve the net zero targets unless we deal with that challenge of getting capital flows from the global north to the global south. So in terms of the mobilization of capital towards transition in developing economies, how can we leverage our leadership in private finance, in the United Kingdom and other developed economies to facilitate this? Because it strikes me this is of really fundamental importance.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I was just going to start by saying, I think the way the UK is moving to implement transition planning requirements across the real economy and financial sectors is obviously world leading, and I think we could undersell that, unwittingly, just because actually the advantage it gives you is that it then turns the focus of those real economy corporates and the financial sector onto the specific challenges of opportunities and challenges of transition. So it gets everybody involved in thinking about how do we get from where we are to where we need to be. In a way that's very powerful, and it's a different approach to, say, the US one, where the IRA creates various tax breaks, etc., and it's a different approach to the European one as well. But I think we could make more of it in terms of how much it will kind of galvanize the real economy and the financial sector to be thinking about the challenges of transition and how we're going to meet them. And one of the ways in which it's already having a bit of an effect, the sort of global and domestic efforts on this front, is that it's sort of creating gentle demand for what I might call a kind of transition finance asset, which doesn't, wholly exist at this stage, but we're getting there. And this is really important in a cross-border context because whilst, as mentioned, there's some hope if you look at the investment in renewables numbers over the last few years, if you strip out advanced economies and you strip out China and you strip out, let's say, India, where they've really been pushing ahead, the numbers for the rest of the world don't look very good. In fact, they start to look a bit anecdotal in terms of the number of projects. And so one of the positive things about having global finance looking for transition assets and coming together with the fact that we know that major emerging market emitters need transition is that there are new approaches being sought that kind of bring together a set of stakeholders that might not normally tackle this challenge. And so we've been trying to support the sort of emerging country platforms, Just Energy, transition partnerships that we're increasingly seeing in a number of countries. And the power of those is that for a major emitter or a country that needs to undergo a complex energy transition like South Africa, Indonesia, Vietnam, it's going to be very difficult to do that without some external financing, and it's very difficult to do it full stop. So these platform approaches are sort of creating a space for each country to lead its own and set its own climate ambition, but with support from international partners who, I guess, both provide some kind of political support, but also financial. And bringing in the private sector fairly early is helping to articulate what is the forward positive set of investments that we can make here to transition, let's say, Indonesia's economy or South Africa's economy, so that they can benefit from the kind of opportunities of transition, whilst we also deal with the thorny problem of accelerating the phase out of their dominant energy systems, sometimes in a situation where they actually have an undersupply of energy, although that's not always the case. And these kind of platforms are bringing together the country that wants to transition. They're raising ambitions. So we saw with the Indonesian announcement around the G20, Indonesia is saying that with the support, we will ratchet up our ambitions. They brought forward peak coal. They've lowered peak coal. They brought forward net zero date for the energy sector. They're putting a pause on some of their coal pipelines. Most of their coal pipelines in the hope that with some collaborative work we can find alternatives. And then, of course, financing is a huge thing, and so we are actively working to support them in exploring across public and private sector and MDBs and so on, how could we finance some of this investment in a way that really crowds in the private sector, giving them the asset class that they're looking for in transition, but also in a way that's affordable for an emerging market against the backdrop of a difficult economic environment. So we think these early mover platforms are a way to kind of unblock the pipeline in terms of finance and also projects, but we hope that then they'll become more readily replicable without quite so much infrastructure for a much wider set of countries, because clearly, there is quite a long list of countries that need to make this transition quite quickly.
Thanks, Hans, very much. I mean, as always with these panels, too many questions, not enough time, and we are running out of time, but I don't want to close this session without inviting our audience to put any particular questions they would like to put to the panel. Has anybody got a question or a burning question? We've got a roving mic, which we can pass to you. Yes, sir, just there. Super. Do say who you are as well, please.
Hi, Craig Nelson from Tech UK, with the trade body for tech firms. It's really aimed at anyone involved in the TPT. So we obviously responded to it saying it was quite hard to implement for smaller companies in particular, and even not even just your SMEs and startups, but your upper end of medium of SMEs. So I was wondering if there's any comment on how the TPT can be adapted or simplified or made more practicable for smaller companies in the real economy, because obviously the sectoral level guidance would be really appreciated. If there's anything that can really distill, just here's 10 things you need to do to make some headway on your own transition pathway.
Okay, would you like to pick that one up?
Sure. So, yeah, thank you very much for the question. In case anyone couldn't hear it too well, I think it was basically about whether the kind of framework that's been laid out by the TPT might be quite sort of complicated, potentially burdensome for smaller companies, even smaller companies at the larger end. So, you know, obviously the TPT is asked to create a kind of a gold standard, what best practice looks like in the context of a commitment for listed companies and financial firms. So the initial sort of audience for this is really the larger companies with the greater capability. But we have had this question, you know, raised to the TPT a lot, and it's very important. So I can confirm that it is something we're very actively looking at this year, and I think we'll be probably having some sort of expert advice on that and considering within the TPT how to address the needs of smaller companies. We'd also be very interested to have comments and inputs on that into our call for evidence. That would be very useful, and it certainly will be looked at and considered. I'd just like to sort of quickly say something on the usability point generally, which is that in what's been done to date by the TPT, the absolute utmost effort has been made to make the framework that the TPT's been proposing fit with what already exists. So this is not something brand new and completely different that has to be learned from scratch. It very much builds on TCFD, which is already now a requirement in the UK. It's extremely aligned to the work of GFANZ. It's extremely aligned to the draft frameworks that have been put out by the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. And for those of you, of a more technical bent, the documents out for disclosure include a technical annex that gives reams of detail on exactly how all that fits together and how that matching has been done. The intent for transition plans, certainly from a TPT's point of view, is to make those part of a business's strategy. So it's very much not another disclosure requirement that you kind of add on to things at the end. It should be part of how a business is thinking about how it will operate going forwards. And I think the question about how should SMEs do that should be thought about in that context.
Thanks, Kate. One last question, I think, down the front here. I think this lady I saw here, so I can't take any more after that because we've got to move on to another session. But this lady down the front. Okay, two ladies down the front. Go on. We'll try and take your questions, both of you, quickly, as long as the panel respond quickly.
Christina Church from BNY Mellon. Question for Alice. Obviously, the transition, the Indonesian partnership was fantastic. But of course, we've got so much money committed within GFANZ that wants to move to a 1.5 degrees pathway. But while, as Tom mentioned, the real economy is closer to 3 degrees, what other actions can we take to really mobilize more and more finances? Great having all these pathways and useful ways to get more regulation, but without seeing the real economy moving in the right direction and governmental support for that, it's very hard to get the financial support.
Alice.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, completely agree. I mean, I think for next year, our focus is going to be sort of two big buckets of work. One is ensuring that transition helps move the real economy. And I think it's around sectoral approaches, really kind of understanding what the challenges in each sector are and how to sort of fix those. And to be honest, it's going to require a combination of public and private action. So I think, lots of people doing work in this space, so my colleagues, in terms of, what does it take to move aviation? What does it take to move steel? What does it... and, of course, some of it can be achieved by private ingenuity alone, but a lot of it does need some kind of public-private collaboration on policy. Sometimes to get there, if we had all the time in the world, maybe we could just let it evolve. But to get there quickly enough, we probably need more policy action on to ensure that we get supply and demand ramped up quickly in some spaces and so on and so forth. So we think that working through the harder to abate sectors next year through the lens of transition is what's needed. And I've been encouraged by the way that some financial sector firms have done transition planning with their major corporate clients, and then talk to them about what will you need to do to transition, what are the obstacles, and then they've gone together to government to speak about what policy gaps here are hindering all of us from making the progress and getting ahead. And I think that's going to be quite, hard work next year, but I think, major economies, those are the kinds of conversations we'll need to have. Thanks.
Thanks, Alice, very much. Final quick question down the front here.
Fiona Clouder, I'm the former regional ambassador for Latin America and Caribbean for COP26. Very encouraging to hear the progress on financing for our future. But there seems to be a fundamental gap in the equation between moving the world to net zero and the supply that's needed for that energy transition, and whether that demand can be met by the mining sector for both the base metals as well as the minerals that are needed. And also the time frame involved. This is urgent, as we know, and we have lots and lots of deadlines for 2030. But unless that investment is made now in the mining sector, given the time lag to develop mining operations, to me there's going to be a huge crunch point in a few years. And again, this is a major opportunity with respect to emerging markets, which hold many of those resources. So my question is, to what extent did that come up at COP27? To what extent is the city thinking about this opportunity? Thank you.
Who would like to pick this up? Tom, do you want to do this one? Or was final comment?
I mean, yeah, the mining sector is obviously crucial. I heard former leader of one of the biggest mining companies in the world say, basically, if you can't grow it, you have to dig it out of the ground. And we are going to need the raw materials to support the transition. And this is why planning transition at a sectoral level, at a government level, at a policy level is important, because you need to see those bottlenecks coming and put policy in place to incentivize the transition to move at the pace that's required.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid, ladies and gentlemen, we have run out of time. I want to thank my fantastic panellists for their remarks to us this morning. You know, here in the City of London, we see the delivery of net zero transition as a critical condition to safeguarding future competitiveness for the United Kingdom as a whole, and indeed, of course, for our professional and financial services industry. So we've now moved on from COP27. We look to COP28. We hope for greater things again from COP28. And thank you again to the panel. And I'm very now pleased to introduce the next panel, who are going to delve into voluntary carbon markets. Thank you all very much indeed.